this edition of Primetime Politics, the Trudeau government tries to clear up continuing confusion over its new testing requirements for international travelers arriving in Canada. And a national advisory committee is recommending COVID-19 booster shots for Canadians over 50. The Canadian economy saw a surge in job creation in November, with 5 times more jobs created than expected. We'll speak with this economist about the bigger picture and what he's watching for in the government's upcoming economic update. And our journalist panel will be in to look at Ottawa's COVID-19 response, Erin O'Toole's new caucus dynamic, and the government's delay in releasing its greenhouse gas action plan. But we start with the latest developments on the pandemic front. First, the National Advisory Committee on Immunization is now recommending what many provinces have already started doing, offering third or booster doses to Canadians over 50 years old who were vaccinated at least 6 months ago.
The data that we have at the moment shows that the vaccines are holding up pretty good against severe outcomes. We're most concerned about severe outcomes in those who are elderly or have other higher risk conditions.
The federal health minister on Friday also gave an update on its travel restrictions announced earlier in the week to curb the spread of the new variant. There were a lot of questions about the requirement that all international travelers arriving in Canada from anywhere besides the U.S. should be tested upon their arrival at a Canadian airport. Here's Health Minister Jean-Yves Duclos.
All travelers should expect to be tested upon arrival and should be ready to isolate. It will take a few days before we are able to test all targeted travelers, but we are ramping up our capacity quickly and testing more and more travelers every day.
Joining me now are 3 MPs from the different parties. Greg Fergus is a Liberal MP for the Quebec riding of Hull-Aylmer and now has been reconfirmed as a parliamentary secretary to the Prime Minister. Scott Aitchison is a newly elected Conservative Labour critic and MP for the Ontario riding of Parry Sound-Muskoka. And Peter Julian is a veteran of the House of Commons. He's the NDP House Leader and Finance critic and MP for New Westminster Burnaby. All 3 of you, thanks for joining me.
It's a pleasure. Good to be here.
Thanks for having us.
Okay, I want to start with the government's COVID-19 response, and especially the response to the latest variant. Greg Fergus, let's start with this because we all watched, or I was watching this afternoon, a press conference from federal officials and from Health Minister Jean-Yves Duclos. It's been 3 days since your government first announced airport arrival testing for all international travelers from everywhere except the U.S., but there are a lot of questions still about where people are going to be tested, whether they'll be able to connect to the other flights once they arrive in Canada to get home. And there's also the big question about why we're not testing people arriving from the U.S. Why are there so many questions after 3 days after the announcement?
Well, first of all, thank you, Martin, for the question, and thank you for giving me an opportunity to explain what's happening. First of all, let's just remember that this pandemic is not over. Omicron has really shown us that how serious these variants can be, and they really pose some difficult choices. The National Advisory Committee and our scientists have been poring over the data, and they've been taking a look at it, and they've offered us the best kind of advice. And the advice is that for the time being, that we're going to be testing we're going to be strengthening our testing regime for people who are originating from international flights. At this time, it's not deemed to be necessary to test the folks coming from the United States on a strengthened basis. So that's the reason why we have the situation that we have right now.
But are you, certainly as a member of the government, you must be a bit apprehensive that right now all the minister can tell us is that things are being ramped up and everything will be ironed out. But this starts to become reminiscent of worries about this turning into a situation like you had with the quarantine hotels. For example, it's not clear whether when I arrive in Toronto, I have to wait for my test results in Toronto or if I can take a connection to Ottawa. These things are still very confused.
What is clear is that you're going to have to, if you're coming from an international destination outside the United States, you're going to have a test that's done before, and then you're going to have to wait for those results before you can, quarantine yourself until you can get the results from that test. Tests nowadays, we have more rapid tests that are able to give results in a much quicker time frame. So chances are people will still be able to go on into their other flights flights to do so. And that is what would allow them or allow to protect Canadians more safely. And it's also really important for people to remember, of course, that you need to get vaccinated. That's the best way for us to fight against this vaccine. And of course, for people to be getting on flights nowadays, you have to be fully vaccinated to get onto a flight. So that should provide us with that base level of protection, which is important.
Okay, Scott Aitchison, you're watching the federal government's response. What do you make of it?
Well, my questions are fairly similar to yours, Martin. We've been asking questions of this government about their new program for entering Canada. What kind of test is going to be required? These are the kinds of questions that Canadians have, and it feels very much like the government hasn't learned anything from the example you gave, the quarantine hotels, or how we managed this in the early days of the pandemic. Canadians are kind of getting tired of this, and I think that they expect their government to be a little better prepared and to give them some more details. The minister can't just trot out an announcement without any details. Canadians need more information, and that's what we keep asking for. We've asked that in the House of Commons again today during question period. And of course, we really didn't get any answers either. So we continue to ask for the government to give more details to Canadians, more information. It's going to make things work a lot smoother and make Canadians a lot more comfortable with what the government's announcing.
Okay, Peter Julian, your reaction to the federal response to the Omicron variant so far?
Some confusion. There's a lack of clarity about messaging. Canadians need to know what the government is asking, and it's very unclear. There seems to be contradiction. There's a lack of clarity. One thing that is very clear is that we need to continue to push Canadians to be vaccinated, but we haven't seen the federal government really make the efforts that the NDP and Jagmeet Singh has been calling for since the beginning of the pandemic to make sure that we have in place domestic production of vaccines. And there is the concern that regardless of domestic production, we also need to be waiving the vaccine patents so that we can ensure that in other countries around the world, on other continents, that we are really streamlining and increasing the vaccine uptake. And so we have to make sure that we're making smart decisions, not only in Canada, but around the world. And in that way, hopefully, we can bring this planet through this pandemic.
Okay, Greg Fergus, on December 14th, we know that Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland will be presenting her economic update. There are growing concerns that the government spending may be contributing to inflation. Your spring budget promised more than $100 billion in new spending over 3 years. You promised yet more during the election campaign. Should Minister Freeland be proposing to dial back some spending in her economic update in about 10 days?
The Minister Freeland and the government has made a very specific promise to Canadians that we're going to have their backs. And we're going to be making sure that we're going to be taking Canadians to get us, take all the measures that are necessary for us to get through the pandemic. And then as we get through the pandemic, we're going to also be making sure that we're going to be working on building back better and stronger in a more durable way. And that's already happening. You saw the numbers come out today, 154,000 new jobs, net new jobs created. This is great news. The Canadian economy really has taken on much of its completely all the job losses it has had, but what has happened as well is that the pandemic is not over. So you're seeing supply chain shortages happening all around the world. Indeed, Canada's cost of living increases are similar to other industrialized, to the European Union, to the United States, to Japan. This is a phenomenon that's happening all around the world. It's not specific to Canada and Canada's particular ways of building back better and having an economy that's working on all four burners. What is really key is that we need to make sure that we take care of the affordability for Canadians. And that's the reason why you're seeing us create $10 a day daycare for families. That's why you're seeing increases in support for seniors.
Okay.
These are all things which are going to make life more affordable for Canadians while making sure that we're keeping everybody safe during the pandemic.
Okay, so Scott Aitchison, we've been watching as your Conservatives since Parliament returned have been slamming the government and blaming inflation and high housing prices on the government. You say the government should cut spending to try and hem in inflation. What major programs would you suggest that they shouldn't have been spending on during the pandemic or that they should now be curbing in the months to come?
Well, the evidence is there for all to see that they were actually quite sloppy about where they spent the money. Too many people who didn't need the supports got the supports. They flooded the Canadian economy with too much money, chasing too few goods because supply chains were in fact disrupted. So people had extra cash and they couldn't buy things, and it made things more expensive. And in fact, it's great that this government talks about having Canadians' backs. Our fear, though, is that because things are getting so much more expensive, you won't be able to put gas in your car in rural Canada to drive your kids to the daycare that they're going to provide for them. You can't afford to put groceries on the table. The only thing they're going to have left is their backs, because this government is basically pricing everything right off of people's backs. So we need to get government spending under control. We think that absolutely there's some targeted spending and targeted supports that will still be needed as we go forward. But it's all the more reason for us to get committees back to work, so that the Finance Committee can focus specifically on where those targeted supports will go, so that we can make sure that when this government gets its blank check, it doesn't just waste money and cause more inflation into the economy.
Okay, Peter Julian, just 30 seconds. We're running out of time, but what would your party hope to see in this economic update?
Well, there's an affordability crisis. We have a housing crisis across the country. We need to see immediate investments in affordable housing. We need to see the government actually taking things seriously. The families are struggling to put food on the table and keep a roof over their head. That means things like public universal pharmacare. And these are prescriptions that other countries are putting into place that are making sure that families aren't falling further and further behind. Now, the government has slashed GIS for seniors that received the CERB. They slashed the CERB benefits. The Conservatives and the Liberals rejoiced at that. This is leaving hundreds of thousands of people, including so many seniors, in a very, very precarious situation. And so what we actually need to do is make sure that the ultra-rich in this country that have benefited from this pandemic beyond belief actually pay their fair share of taxes. And that is the way to ensure that we can continue to make investments that help Canadians. Okay, well, on that note, we will have obviously a lot of chance to revisit this issue. I want to thank all three of you for taking the time. Thanks for speaking with us.
Thanks a lot, Martin.
Thanks for having me.
We've seen more than 150,000 jobs that have been added. So I think as Canadians are looking across the country, I think that's very good news for our economy. It says that, we have a plan and it's working.
That was Innovation and Industry Minister François-Philippe Champagne reacting to the more than 154,000 new jobs created in Canada in November. There were job gains in all regions of the country and in all sectors of the economy. November's figures reduced the unemployment rate to 5.7%, and that's down from 6%. Joining me to look at the numbers is Pedro Antunes. He is the Chief Economist for the Conference Board of Canada. Mr. Antunes, thanks for joining us.
Oh, it's my pleasure. It's great to be here.
Now, I know economists like yourself always warn us journalists not to make too much out of 1 month's numbers. But how do you see, what do you see as the significance of these numbers for November? And then feel free to put them in a larger context.
No, I think generally this is good news. And yes, of course, you want to be careful with 1 month. But what we've seen is time and time again here through this pandemic that as the economy's reopened, we've seen the job market really resilient, picking up again. And with the numbers in November, we're actually slightly above, I would say, where we were pre-pandemic. So that is very good news. The unemployment rate, just to correct you a little bit, the unemployment rate is actually 6% nationally today, in comparison to 5.7% where it was in 2019. But remember, 2019 was a very good year for labor markets, and we'd hit a record low in terms of the unemployment rate in that year. And when you look across the provinces, some really important declines in the unemployment rates, especially in the eastern provinces. In Quebec, unemployment rate down to 4.5%. So what the problem is now is one of almost, and we're seeing it in the job vacancies, it's almost around the shortage of workers that is going to constrain and hold back the economy.
The only reason I ask about putting it in context is that some people have suggested that this could be a 1 month blip because of certain clouds on the horizon, and they're especially talking about the disruption to the economy in BC, the disruption, yet more disruption in supply chains, and the Omicron variant and its potential that people are saying we're keeping our powder dry in terms of predicting if this is going to be sustained.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of uncertainty for sure in the economy. And as we go forward, there are many risks, including the ones you've talked about. Certainly, we're hopeful that the supply chain disruptions, I mean, it's been a massive and really, in terms of the human cost and the animal costs, a terrible event that we've seen in BC. But hopefully the disruptions in terms of transportation infrastructure will be short-lived, and we won't see too much of an economic impact, nationally at least, in terms of those transportation bottlenecks. So in terms of Omicron, I would agree. There's a lot of uncertainty about what happens next. Will we see another wave of shutdowns? But there's, I think, hope in the sense that every time we've seen these wave after wave, we've seen less and less of an impact on the economy. And despite the fact that this variant is really scary, I think on the horizon we're also seeing treatments for COVID-19 coming along. So I think there's hope for positive news there.
Okay, if the positive trend, as we've talked about, is sustained, some economists, I don't know if you're among them, are suggesting it could mean that the Bank of Canada, looking at this sort of robust growth, might move ahead its increase in interest rates expected this spring, that could actually be advanced. Some people are saying that could be good news in the fight against inflation. Your thoughts on that?
Well, certainly I think this is a challenge for the bank at the moment. The bank wants to maintain credibility, and we're already seeing inflationary pressures quite high across the board. So yes, I think this is going to be a challenge for the bank, and possibly we'll see the bank react more quickly earlier next year rather than later next year. And really, I think it's the bank's impact in terms of raising interest rates. We need to remember that it's really an issue around credibility. We need to ensure that people believe that inflation is going to come back down to zero, so that we don't start getting, expectations around higher wages and in terms of employees and expectations in terms of higher costs in terms of firms. We don't want that vicious cycle to take off. So it's really about the Bank of Canada setting the credibility and anchoring expectations. And I think to do that, they will have to likely react a little more quickly, certainly, than what was previously planned.
Okay, I want to get to what we're looking ahead to. December 14th, Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland is going to be presenting her economic update to the nation. What are you watching for, and what would you hope to see in that update?
Well, certainly the economy has rebounded and has come back, and I think there's still a lot of wherewithal in the economy. If you look at household balance sheets, they're in great shape. We've seen the support programs that the federal government and some of the provinces have put in place really hold up household incomes through this pandemic and recession. So I think what we want to see is, a little taking off of the gas pedal, if anything, at least in the near term, until we see essentially some of these inflationary pressures come off. Now, I know there's a lot of talk around holding up certain segments of the economy. I certainly, with Omicron coming along, we're going to see a tougher time for tourism industries and for air transportation, for example. So if we are targeting certain measures at those, I certainly think we might see some of that. The other thing I'm very hopeful for is that, as with some of the provincial governments, we'll see perhaps better than expected results on the revenue side. Not only are household balance sheets holding up well, but so have business profits. So hopefully we'll see some good news in terms of perhaps smaller deficits that we've tacked up over the last year and a half.
Okay, Pedro Antunes, thank you very much. We will watch that economic update with interest. Thanks for sharing your thoughts with us.
Well, thanks for having me on the show, Martin. It's a pleasure.
Joining me now are two members of the Parliamentary Press Gallery. Bob Fife is the Ottawa Bureau Chief for the Globe and Mail, and Mia Rabson is the Parliamentary and National Reporter for the Canadian Press. Both of you, thanks for joining us. Let's start with what everyone's been speaking about so much this week, and that is the Trudeau government's response to the new variant of the coronavirus. I'll start with you, Mia. You've been following this pandemic for 2 years. You've been filing on this pandemic. What do you make of the latest developments?
The latest developments, to quote Dr. Theresa Tam, the country's top doctor, it's very complicated. We have a new variant that we don't know a lot about. We have a government that is trying to respond as quickly as they can so they can avoid some of the criticism they've had in the past about being slow out of the blocks when there's new variants that are coming. We don't know whether this variant is going to respond to vaccines. And the government, decided that they were going to ban travel from some countries, and they're going to start testing people coming back, except from the US, and except if you're fully vaccinated, you can go home. There are so many different scenarios that are so complicated. Like, you'd need a flow chart that's 7 pages long in order to understand it. And they sort of admit that today. They know that it's complicated. They know they haven't done a great job communicating it, and it's a big problem for them right now.
Bob, is there a problem with the rushed response? Because a lot of people were praising them for responding quickly, unlike with previous variants, but then they also pay the price of not having everything rolled out once they've already announced it.
Well, look, there is definitely a lot of confusion here, and this is upsetting people's Christmas plans for sure. But it's hard to fault the government for clarity on this issue. We only learned last Friday about this new, very potentially dangerous variant, and governments around the world are responding as quickly as they can, and there is a lot of confusion for sure, but better that they respond with some kind of measures to try to prevent the spread of this potentially dangerous variant. And it is going to be confusing, though. If you come in from outside the country, you're going to have to come in with a PCR test at least 72 hours. When you land at a Canadian airport, God knows of the lineups, but you're going to have to get a PCR test, and you're going to have to go home and then Zoom with a nurse and then send it by registered mail. And you'll probably be at home quarantined for 3 days or so before you get the results back. So that is definitely a bummer for everybody, except from the United States.
Except if
you'll be able to go into the United States or come back from the United States, you're not going to have that problem. And one of the reasons for that, Martin, is I think it would just jam up the lineups at the Canada-U.S. border, would make it impossible for anybody to do that.
Okay, and we will follow this. We follow this ongoing and developing story. I want to talk about another surprise politically, a development this week. I think we were all caught off guard when Erin O'Toole's Conservatives proposed and unanimously passed and fast-tracked and passed the government's legislation banning conversion therapy. It was heralded, I mean, obviously as a welcome development for human rights. But it was also a pretty successful political move. It's being called that by Mr. O'Toole. What do you make of it, Bob?
Well, look, this was a good week for Erin O'Toole. He hasn't had many of those since the House came back with some of the social conservatives and the anti-vaxxers. But they were very successful in making the point to people in caucus on Wednesday, look, you've all had an opportunity to debate this legislation and to vote on it in the last Parliament. This is not doing us any good by doing this. Let's just let the bill pass and go off to the Senate. And surprisingly, everybody agreed to that, much to Mr. O'Toole's relief, because the Conservative Party has been hurt very, very, very badly by the actions of Conservative MPs who seem to be taking the side of anti-vaxxers in this whole controversy.
Mia, does this mean that Mr. O'Toole has now discovered or implemented or imposed a new discipline and a new political savvy in his ranks? And the other question that begs is whether that will still apply to the Conservative senators. Because as we remember, Denise Batters has still not been expelled from the Conservative Senate caucus. Are they going to be renegades on this issue?
The Senate, of course, is a big question mark because we haven't seen what they're going to do with it. And they certainly made problems for this legislation in the spring when it was in front of Parliament the first time. What Erin O'Toole did this week is prove to himself, to his caucus, and to Canadians that he actually is the leader of the party. He made a decision. He managed to convince his MPs to follow that decision, and they did. It took the Liberals completely off guard. They were not expecting this. Some of them were surprised, many of them pleasantly surprised. It was sort of this one moment, for given how polarized and the sharp partisanship we've seen on Parliament Hill in many, many years. It was one of those moments where partisanship sort of was put aside for the moment, and you actually did see people working together, which just doesn't happen very often. So that alone was surprising. But for sure, Mr. O'Toole has had big questions about whether he had control over parts of his caucus, whether they would listen to him and follow his lead. this week he proved they did.
Okay, Bob, I want to ask you, and this is a story that takes a lot of recapping, but in the last days of the previous Parliament, they were marked by a standoff. Parliament had ordered the production of documents from the Public Health Agency of Canada. Those documents were regarding the firing of 2 Chinese scientists from the high-security National Microbiology Lab in Winnipeg. Government refused, saying the documents were sensitive, and that the firing, and they recognized that the firing of those 2 scientists was for security reasons. So it was a standoff. The other parties didn't accept the government's argument, and in fact, we saw the head of the Canada Public Health Agency dragged before the Speaker and reproached for having violated an order of Parliament. It's come back. Where are things now? The Liberals are now proposing another solution.
Well, the Liberals have offered a compromise, one that they had not been willing to do. In fact, when the House came back and the opposition wanted to restore the order of demanding these documents, the government House leader, Mark Holland, said no, you had to start the whole process over, which was the delaying tactic. It would take months for this to take place. They realized that probably the Speaker was not going to side with them, and they Thursday afternoon, Mr. Holland came up with a compromise, which is that they'll set up a special committee of members with a member from each of the parties, the Liberals, NDP, Conservatives, and Bloc Québécois. They would get the redacted, unredacted documents and be able to look at these documents involving the firing of these scientists and the transfer of very serious deadly viruses to Wuhan Virology Institute in Wuhan. But if there was a dispute about what should be released public, that would be decided by a panel of 3 former senior judges. So this, to me, is a compromise that probably will be accepted by the opposition parties. It means that that Parliament is supreme. Parliament will get to see these documents, and they will be judicious in deciding which can be released to the public. But the government won't be able to avoid, if there was embarrassing information about how the government mishandled that, they are not going to be able to claim that's national security. Yeah. But if there was, the Americans have provided human source intelligence on what may have gone on, that clearly would not be released to the public. So, I mean, and this was something that was proposed in 2010 when there was an impasse over producing documents in the case of Afghan detainees, which makes it all the more palatable. We can't leave, Mia, without talking about Environment Minister Stephen Guilbeault, who has announced this week that the government's putting off by 3 months releasing its federal plan on GHG emissions. This was required to be made public by the end of this year. What's going on, Mia? Essentially, the election is going on. It interrupted again this plan. The new net zero legislation that they passed in the spring, it requires them to come up with a plan and produce a plan publicly for meeting the new targets for 2030. And they're supposed to do it by the end of December, but the legislation did give them an out that they could ask for another 3 months. He's asking for another 3 months. He's saying he's doing it because they want to consult. They want some written submissions from Indigenous leadership, from provinces, territories, some other experts. But ultimately, they just didn't have the time to pull this together that they wanted to, and they want to make sure that they sort of have more people on board with it before they put it down on paper. So we will finally have our greenhouse gas plan, the concrete one, in March? March 29th is the end of it. I mean, we do know most of what's going to be in there already, all of the stuff from the election. The question is, of course, how many emissions we might cut from some of those things and how some of them will be implemented. Okay. Those are the big question marks. All right. Both of you, a very busy first week and a half of Parliament, and it's all coming home to roost now. Thanks for your time, and thanks for going over all these subjects. Thank you. Thank you. Well, that's all the time we have for Primetime Politics tonight. I'm Martin Stringer. Thanks for watching, and have a great weekend.